Hello, Acid Horizon listeners. This is Craig, and today we are doing an episode of Inner Experience. Before we start that, however, I would like to once again announce that we are doing reading groups on our Patreon page starting very soon. Right now, we are taking suggestions and gathering up folks' different interests, and these readings will comprise some of our monthly seminars. So if you'd like to do philosophy with a group of friends in an environment that's safe and comfortable and fun, hop onto our Patreon and join for as little as $1. Today's episode of Inner Experience involves the psychotherapist Carl Rogers. Also, an ensuing discussion of grief and suicide ideation starts at about the 30-minute mark, so just be aware if that's a sensitive topic for you. Okay, let's begin.
Inner Experience.
Welcome to Your Inner Experience. It is 2022, and today on the show we have one of our friends and patrons. His name is Chuck, and he is a therapist, and he has been following our podcast for a while, and he's been involved with our reading group somewhat. And today we wanted to talk about a variety of things. We were first going to start out by talking about emotion and men's mental health and therapy, but what I came to discover was Chuck had only been practicing therapy for a month, and then the pandemic hit. And we have several questions for Chuck because Chuck is an avid reader of philosophy, and he has expressed to me that he uses philosophy in his practice, and actually it's a sort of go-to for him. So there are a plethora of disjoint questions that we have for Chuck. We'll be talking about, all of our favorite French theorists and what have you. But first of all, welcome to the show, Chuck. How are you today?
Doing pretty good. It's really exciting to be here. I've been listening to all of your disembodied voices for like 2 years. And in my development as a therapist / bringing me back into the world of philosophy, this podcast, as well as Machinic Unconscious, those brought me into a whole new world of philosophy I had never really encountered, which has been both mind-blowing and foundationally destructive for a while now, which is great. So it's cool to be on this side of the mic and a part of the show.
I mean, it's flattering, but also scary knowing that we have even this modicum of impact on folks in the world. But maybe we'll start with this question. Like I said, we did a sort of green room conversation about you and your origin story, as it were. Here's some things that maybe we need to get established. What kind of therapy or counseling are you doing? Who are the predominant theorists, or what are the predominant methods involved in your practice? And how did all of that, what was the process there? And then how was it only practicing for a month, and then the pandemic arrives, and I'm guessing you're on Zoom or Skype or something like that. Tell us about that whole history and process.
When I became, oh my God, it's like, where do you start with this? Let's jump in the middle. So when I decided to jump in to do so I have a master's in philosophy that I graduated from back in 2013. And then when I decided to become a therapist years later, I had left philosophy like at the door. I was largely unsatisfied with my thesis at the time. I was largely unsatisfied with understanding how to use it, because with my background, I know I was talking to you a little bit about this off camera the first time we met, Craig, but I'm a very selfish philosopher, I would say. So I read things to try to find the tools to try to understand what the hell I'm looking at, basically. And so when I started in my master's of psychology, within the first couple of months, I became very excited about what the career would look like and incredibly bored of the material. And I had never studied psychology before this. And when I got in, I was expecting, deep theories and all kinds of crazy stuff that you find in philosophy, which is a lot of fun. And I found it very dry, and a lot of that bothered the hell out of me. So in order to keep me interested in one master's, I kind of floated back to philosophy as kind of hobby reading. And in that hobby reading, I looked over some notes from my undergrad and ended up seeing the name Whitehead, Alfred Whitehead. And I said, well, shits and giggles, why don't we pick up Process and Reality? Because I don't know who would ever think that that was a fun time, but here we are. And so I started studying Whitehead at the same time as I was reading psychology. Now, this might seem a bit odd, but what I learned from Whitehead that I didn't learn from my master's or my philosophic upbringing was that you can look at a concept like a process or relationship as a thing to think about. And so I had never learned about postmodern thought. I never learned about anything. I ended at Hegel. We danced in Nietzsche for 5 minutes, but that was a maddening experience because of the professor, and that's it. So basically my stuff stopped at Hegel until I started reading Whitehead, and Whitehead invariably led me to Deleuze. So you can picture me studying both at the same time, trying to dance in both worlds. And so what ended up happening was I started to get a little put off by how in some areas of psychology, you can put people in boxes. Mm-hmm. It's like mental health looks good in boxes. And so it's never about the experience of what people are having. And like being open to the experience is a big one that I got from Deleuze. Was it worthy of the event sort of idea? It was always about how do we have a normal functioning person in this giving place? And I get that there's times where that's called for, but it doesn't really get to the heart of it. And so from there, this long story will now lead me to Carl Rogers. So I'm not sure if you've read any Carl Rogers. He was a psychotherapist. He changed the game of psychotherapy because of how he viewed the person when they come into the room. But his whole point was that when the person comes into the room, their entire world comes with them. A therapist can't sit here and teach you how to live. That's your job. But the therapist can help you highlight barriers that might be showing up and hold space so you can chew on it. And so for me, this all tied together as to how I do therapy. And so it's really all about this idea that largely for most things, when people are coming in, let's say with a problem, with an issue, it's a response to the environment, like to the world around them, not necessarily them waking up one day and going, you know, it'd be great. Debilitating anxiety. That sounds like a great way to spend a weekend. Right? And so I ended up finding narrative therapy through Deleuze. And this is where Todd May kind of came in. And so I was listening to a lot of Todd May's work on difference and repetition. Because up until one episode of Acid Horizon, where Will let me know that DNR was actually a PhD thesis, which I would have loved to have known ahead of time because I wouldn't have read it. That wouldn't have been the first fucking book I read. So I got the Todd May thing, and then I joined narrative therapy. And so the type of therapy I do isn't really pigeonholed into like one thing, like narrative therapist or whatever. It's more related to like what I'm encountering in the room at the time. So I have a lot of training in different disciplines, largely pulling a lot from philosophy, but it's really about what I'm encountering when people walk in the room.
Maybe you could give us some insight. What is different about Carl Rogers' psychotherapy in terms of methodology? I mean, right off the bat, I'm imagining there's going to be different sorts of questions, maybe a sort of engaged listening practice that might be different. But what were you taught? And given what you've read, you know, with respect to Deleuze, Todd May, and so forth, I mean, where does that dovetail? And give me an example of how you might use that in practice.
So Carl Rogers, the way he views like the human being, let's say, is kind of like an organism. So he takes it from the biological level of organism, where the imperative for an organism is to live and thrive in their environment. Mm-hmm. So how they do that is entirely dependent on the environment they're in and how their needs and wants evolve over time through this direct experience with both the engagement with the environment and their engagement with themselves. So it's a symbiotic relationship. So where issues show up is when you're trying to be something and your environment, your parents, all these things are interjecting with ways you're supposed to be. One thing that always comes up for me is, you know, if you have a kid and you always see these parents who are like, make sure you hug everybody, maybe not now in COVID, but you know, you're leaving a family gathering and the kid's like, I don't want to, right? Well, you have to, or to say please, right? And so there's people who are like forcing you to hug people. And that's like a body autonomy problem that you're then going, it's an interjection that's then going to teach people that maybe it's okay to do that if you can see where the line of thought is going. Or they want to say thank you or please, but the kid's not really into that at the moment, but they understand kind of what it's for, but you're forcing them to do something. So it's these moments where the parents are forcing that causes disconnect in the personality and it's disconnect in how the organism wants to thrive. So the job of the parents would then be to teach the organism how to appreciate how they're thriving, if that makes sense, how to be open to the experience of thriving and to catch them when they fall. You get hurt. Okay, well, let's deal with that kind of deal. So in the therapeutic room, that is really his whole point is all about the safe space, safe, non-judgmental and empathic space. That's called the necessary and sufficient conditions for Rogers for proper therapy, where it begins with immediately respecting the person who comes in the room. Because as we know, I mean, it's hard enough to call a therapist, let alone show up for your first therapy session. That's a heavy thing, potentially embarrassing thing to do. And so right off the bat, you respect them coming in. And the method involved with talking to them is about, it's almost pure empathy and congruence. So what that means is, as a therapist myself, I'm very direct with people about what I'm saying, so they don't have to guess what I'm thinking. And not playing therapy tricks. That's a big one.
Give us an example of a therapy trick.
So like a therapy trick, let's say, okay, so if I have a client, let's say they're dealing with anxiety, and the anxiety is over going to a job, getting a job, let's say. So one kind of therapy trick would be, I know that having a job is good. They're not going to get very far in their life if they don't have a job. So that's already two judgments. So how can I get them to think about, oh yeah, I would like a job. So what sort of questions where I can steer the ship so they can come to this particular conclusion? And so he was very against steering the ship. And that's like a hell of a hard thing to do. And I'm not very good at it, but I try every day. But it's all about suspending those judgments. So in therapy, there's videos when he does this. It's kind of amazing. Where what he'll do is called thematic summaries. So he has 3 forms of summary. So if somebody's telling a story, he'll play it back. So a thematic summary would be, you know, if the client says, this is why the job hunt is difficult, then he would just simply say, these are what you have identified as the job being difficult. Full stop. So the client can hear it, digest it themselves. There's something called a feelings summary, where if somebody's telling you a story, but they're not necessarily connected to their feelings, you can play it back. So what I heard was, you're angry and frustrated. Am I right about that? Sometimes you are, sometimes you're not. And then finally, a meaning summary, which is where you've talked to them for a couple of sessions. You're starting to think, you know what? I'm wondering if this is what it means to you.
You would think if you had a society that functioned at least at 75% of an optimum level, these are the sorts of things these are the kinds of phrases and so forth that we would be using in our relationships. I mean, as a teacher, I've been, taught maybe, not using Carl Rogers per se, but like those methodologies and those modalities are something that we learn in workshops and whatnot, and have become part of my practice as a teacher. Of course, that bleeds over into my real life relationships. And then, of course, it's difficult because if you've had parents, for example, and you've been dealing with them one way, and then you ask, is that what you meant by that, mom or dad, right? It can really complicate the relationship.
Well, I really like this idea of, not focusing on putting things into categories, because one of the most annoying, persistent things about certain sort of psychopathology, ways of doing psychopathology today is the DSM. Where it's like you have this meaning summary, symptom summary given in advance, and you try to sort of use the summary as kind of like a filter over whatever the experience is coming in. And it seems like it's being more objective because, the book is itself an object. You have all of these, verified, universally applicable forms. But I really like the work of R.D. Laing, where he talks about being merely objective and not treating the experience, the existential, the being in the world of the person being analyzed into that therapeutic experience. And I quite like the idea of the summary because you're sort of enumerating all of these different aspects of that experience whilst not actually bringing it into heel of any predetermined schema, let's say. I'd like a schema, just a purely categorization. A schema is just a sense of rule. The categories is determinate qualitative listing, and I think it's definitely good to have that kind of space operative. And I guess during the pandemic, one of my questions would be, how easy is it to construct that kind of space of a therapy session? Because usually it's in a one-to-one room, or you might have, I don't know if you've done any therapeutic work online, but it's hard to make that kind of space of empathy, that secluded space which is almost like a kind of a space of free play, where you are still being objective, but you're just not being merely objective. You're not treating them as a mere object. The object is an experiencing thing. It is a thinking thing, a being thing, a becoming thing. And it's that all that activity happens. I just wanted to ask about what sort of space is presupposed in this time of pandemic and also psychoanalysis.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, you said a lot there that just kind of sparked my brain, because it really is about free play. I mean, if you can hear like what's under Rogers' approach and my approach, it's really about getting to know the other person. That's it, right? Like, help me understand you, right? How do I understand this being that's in front of me with their own world and their own experiences and their own affects, and how they engage, what context are they engaging with, all of these things. And if I bring something in like the DSM, which you kind of intuited was like one of the first things to piss me off when I was training, is I'm assuming, and this is like a really key thing that we'll park and then I'll go to your actual question, but I'm assuming that something is broken. When you categorize people, you're assuming something is broken. Here's the issue they're having. There's damage. And that's a medical model approach. When someone comes in with anxiety, they didn't break their arm, right? The world around them, something has happened in their world that is causing an expression of a defense, and they're doing the best they can with it. So who the hell am I to say, yep, so you're having anxiety, so here's like a paper bag, and you're going to do the thing anyway, right? Like, fantastic. I've now identified you as something that's broken, but that makes little sense. And so when it comes to the pandemic, this has been so interesting, because I was able to do live therapy for a month and then right into virtual and telephone. Now, I am somebody who's like, you can probably tell, extremely energetic. And so one of the things I noticed as a therapist was like sitting down and looking at someone is that I can be really fucking intense, because all of the energy is like, I am looking at you now. So I am totally into everything. I can tell you the rhythm of your breathing, the response to the lighting. Like, it's pretty scary, actually. But I'm somebody who needs to move. So one of the gifts of the pandemic, if I can say that, is that I was able to do this over the phone. But one of the thoughts I had when I was in live therapy is that I imagine that some of the clients I was having would really benefit from like movement, acting in the body as well as talking. So I had already thought that come spring, I was going to start walking therapy, where we take a hike in the forest and just chat it out. Because then, in a very Ponty way, you're engaging the whole being, which is the whole point, right? We're not just disembodied heads. So a couple of things that have changed with creating that space is that when it's over the phone, I can no longer use my body as part of the objects in the environment. So one instance is like when you're talking to somebody, naturally as human beings, if you're open to it, if somebody's saying something really interesting, you're going to lean in, or something shocking, you're just going to do it. And that's part of the game, right? Or you're going to turn your head if you didn't quite hear them. There's all these things that happen physically. So all of those elements are gone. But what was amazing was how much you hone in on the words people use, the tone that they used it in, the rhythm of the breathing. All of this life pours through on the receiver, which I didn't realize. That kind of makes up for it. And if you're approaching therapy as, in a weird way, I always say having coffee with a friend, as really listening to somebody, then you can create that, whether that's physical or over the phone, because somebody actually gives a shit about what's happening. And they're not just waiting for their turn to speak so they can cure you or something.
It's almost like a constructive constraint of sorts. Is the fact that people are doing therapy from their bedroom or their home office or their backyard, has it changed? I mean, I know that you were only doing it in person in your office for like a month, but like, what are some of the impacts that you were able to see from that?
Some of the major impacts, so this is not the case for everyone, but some of the major impacts, if I'm dealing with someone, let's say, who is dealing with social anxiety, for instance, being in a familiar area, so their own environment, then they get the home space advantage. And I really like that because it shifts the power dynamics a little bit. Because they're home, I'm not actually there. And in the, part of my consent process is I try my best to show them the powers they have. And one of those is like, just fucking hang up on me. If you don't like where this is going, just hang up. That's a lot less awkward than leaving the room. Nope, right? And if you can turn the volume, you can manipulate this in any safe way that you want. And I'm never going to question it because it's what you need at the time. Who am I? And so there's ways to give them, well, they give themselves the home stage advantage, which takes care of a little bit of the anxiety. And it also helps some people open up in a way they might not have in the room, because in the room, you're in an unfamiliar space. So my job is to make that space safe. So that's what the symbols, right? What clothes am I wearing? What pictures are on my wall? How is all this gonna look, right? Because it's all a pre-staged event. But for when you're at home, that's up to you. So I have clients who take me for a walk through the woods, which is great. I love it. So it's really, it gives them that sense of power, which allows them to decide how they're going to open up, which for me is key.
Will, did you want to get in there?
Yeah, I do. I feel like there's like an element of the confessional just by the setting of the stage of the camera, right? Precisely. I think about because my university is starting up again in a few days, and we're doing online, and of course, like there's that anxiety that comes with, all right, what precisely how much of my room do I want to show to my classmates, or like, and I feel like just that initial distance can also have an element of like immediate intimacy, right? Because like you're talking to someone in their office, right? Which is where either they spend a lot of their time, or their bedroom, right? Which is even more exposing. So I wonder, like, is there an element to this sort of post-isolation form of communication that actually in a certain kind of way is more intimate than, say, a coffee shop conversation, where there are what we often consider like the surpluses of communication, right? So like the slight shift in the shoulder, or like when someone gets rather loud and you start to see like spit and like anger, emanate from them. In a certain sense, like even though there's a kind of saccharine separation, right? Because I'm flattened out on the screen right now with all of you, but like you see my bed, you see my Michel Foucault poster and things like that, right? So in a sense, like I'm showing you a lot more than, let's say, or like the broken blinds next to me here. Like there is a sort of element that there's a surplus element that just shows you like the state of my life, right? So in a sense, the way that I manage that confession, the way I angle the camera, I think in some ways tell someone quite a bit about the way that they function in this new world of communication. Yes. Has that been the case at all?
Absolutely. And I like that you mentioned that, because I've had a couple of conversations like this with my colleagues, so I'm very aware that it's my philosophic background that makes me think of that, because of how we shape our environment, like with Merleau-Ponty and all these. And so when you're looking at some, like behind me, you see all the books, right? And every one of them, I always joke around with people that this is like looking into my brain. I've engaged with everything. And it's one of the reasons it's so messy or arranged a certain way is because it's arranged based on how I'm working through the books so that I know. And so when people come in, they're looking at me. And so when you talk to me, it's very apparent. So what's a lot of fun is when you're with a client and you're like, it's like responsibility and freedom in Sartre. And then I'm just like grabbing the Sartre book and like, let's read it together or something like that. For myself, it's allowed me to bring people into a more intimate space as a therapist and see the environment as it's shaped or designed by them, which is part of the personality. Because like I said before, and I take this incredibly seriously, when a client walks into your room, picks up the phone, or is right in front of you, their whole world shows up. It's not an isolated being, because we're not isolated beings. So being able to see the windows into their environments is cool and touching, because you're being invited in. And that layers the conversation a little bit more, because they don't have to, right? I have clients who will have conversations with me or go on their phone in their car. Different pieces like that, which is also telling. So it's all like Irving Yalom would say, grist for the mill, as part of like getting to know people and being with them.
It's interesting too, and I know that this is going to bother Craig because he's not seen it, and it was a very public confession to say that you've not seen The Sopranos in 2022. But there's this there's this moment where I guess the protagonist, Tony Soprano, is sitting in the waiting room for his therapist, who will be, a pivotal character for the whole show. And he just goes on and on about the choices of decor in the waiting room. And in a certain sense, like, I've had my fair share of therapy. And there's so much that you can get about the nature of the encounter just from the books they decide to display, the paintings they decide to put up. And it almost feels as though when one walks into a counselor's office, a therapist's office, or a psychologist's office, they get to set the stage, right? It's usually there is a bit of a design, I'm going to use this word loosely, design philosophy around the way in which, these encounters are staged, right? Very, very kind of comfortable, modern, 2 chairs and maybe a desk, but it's usually off to the side and so on. But here it seems as though like we each get to stage the way in which we approach this. Whereas it's not just me, driving 15 minutes, finding, the building across the street from the general hospital, and then marching into a sort of sanitized waiting room, waiting 15 minutes. As the other person leaves, I get to come in through this new door that you have established for incoming patients. It seems like even though there is this disconnection, and if you watch the news, right, like psychologists and so on are obsessed about the kind of the unique alienation of the mental alienation, like the 19th century theory of mental alienation and the implication of like Zoom fatigue and so on. But at the same time, like there are all of these different creative avenues that manifest. So in a certain sense, like this kind of graphing, this tracing over of old symptomatologies, of outdated categorizations, right? So like one of the fundamental functions of normalizing power is the process of categorization, right? Like that is the sense in which ocular capture gets to finalize itself in the category. And like, I feel as though so much of what we're talking about circulates around this sort of perpetual problem of psychiatric power. It's like, tell me your life and then I will tell you your life, right? It's not a question of, do you agree with that? It's a question of, tell me what has happened and I will tell you what you are worth. And I feel as though like all of these disruptions can be really, really negative and have like serious and important implications for like our emotional health, our communal well-being. But they also always provide these avenues of like new forms of pedagogical resistance in like radical psychiatry. Like, so I don't know. I just think it's fascinating that this happened right when you had initiated your practice. And I feel as though you're forced not only to deal with this new terrain, but you don't have the same baggage that a lot of your colleagues do, where you have 50 years of practice and then it's redefined. It's like, no, like this new terrain is new to you, but you're also new to the entire field, irrespective of it.
Yeah, I really like that, because that when I called it a gift, that's almost exactly what I mean, right? So I remember when my colleagues at work still make fun of me for this, but when I walked into the office for the first time as a practicum student, I showed up in like a sharp blue suit. I looked like I walked off a movie set. I was like, I'm supposed to do this because it's a business. I don't know, right? And they made fun, and they were all sitting there with like yoga pants and like band t-shirts. And I walked in for the meeting and I was like, oh fuck, I misread this entire situation. They made fun of me for it, which was fantastic. And so part of like my issue becoming a therapist was like, I really don't like the idea of telling people how to live their life. And I'm so sensitive to the symbols and all that stuff. And when you walk into a therapist office, because essentially, and you put it like way better than I could, but essentially it's like a wrestling match between how people are living their life, so the experience they're having, and the medical model. Constant wrestling match between the two. And so when I showed up in my suit, I was walking into this track of just, I am the professional, right? So I had already, despite my background, I had already screwed up on day one. And so after that was taken away from me, and they were like, no, don't do things like that. They asked me to set up my room. And I'll never forget this. They asked me to set up my room, and they had like some furniture in there, and it was like dusty because it was a new room. And I just didn't. I just like pushed things aside and was like, eh. So what I'm going to do is show up to work exactly as I am. And I like showed up with my t-shirts, and once Crit Drip showed up, it was like a philosophy t-shirt every day that people would talk to me about. And so I would just show up with like funny socks and my shirt, and I'm just like, bleh, this is who I am. I'm a mess. I'm not a business guy. So how are we going to do this together, kind of thing. And so I already started to play with that a little bit, and it was very uncomfortable, like sitting on a pre-made area, like all that stuff. And so I always felt very lucky when I was able to jump in, and it was like, oh, now I have to invite you into my room, or over the phone, because I was like, welcome to my space. I'm not going to change any of this for anyone. If you like it, stay. If you don't, I'll help you find a therapist that's better for you. No problem.
Wow. Well, hey, thanks for the paid promotion there. That was
You're
excellent.
Welcome. The Anti-Oedipus, my favorite one.
That's right. Well, speaking of Anti-Oedipus, here's what's on my mind. And maybe you heard this from me in a previous episode. I went to therapy notably 2 times in my life. Once when I lived overseas, and once here in the United States. The first time I would say, I was going through some issues. The second time I went, I hate to say that I was kind of a tourist, but it was kind of a practicum because I was looking at the work of Carl Jung, and my insurance plan allowed me X number of visits per year. And then I actually paid for a couple of them myself. And, I decided to work on some things. And one of the things that inevitably came up in the therapeutic space was the topic of politics. And given the fact that you've looked at the work of Deleuze and Guattari, particularly Anti-Oedipus, and given the pandemic right now, which is a massively hypercharged political event, what happens in the therapeutic space for you and for any of the clients that you work with when politically charged events come up? And here's my assumption, and correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe you have an awareness like, wow, people's trauma is overdetermined by numerous factors. The economy and the way our society is structured is a big one. So now, what do you do with that? Because I'll say that I was kind of rebuffed in therapy. Like when I brought up political topics, there seemed to be a wall there. And maybe that wasn't uncommon for a Jungian analyst, even though he was great.
Well, this is part of respecting the client when they walk in the room, right? So I've used anxiety a lot, so I'll just keep going with that one, but we can go on the other emotions afterwards. We know that anxiety is a form of defense, and we know where these somatic markers are. We know what that looks like when it shows up, and we know why. The amygdala response, nervous system, all that jazz, all that biology fun stuff that I love. But what we also know is that we're not really taught how to manage these symptoms in the sense of, well, for instance, let's donate to the world a worldwide pandemic to teach people how to manage their anxiety symptoms. Right? Because as if life wasn't fast-paced and nuts enough, we have a worldwide pandemic. And so when people are coming into the room and they're worried about, back when Trump was in office, Trump got elected, and we're up in Canada, and people are like, holy shit, right? Mm-hmm. All of these things in the environment are going to be playing with your ability to manage your anxiety. We only have so much. I always picture it a lot like... they call it window of tolerance, but I don't really like that word. I'm more along the lines of like circle of capacity. Literally meaning how much can you handle in a fucking day, right? Like how much can you handle? And so I picture it a lot like an RPM gauge in a car. So everyone has a different capacity for how they can handle life events. Human beings, because we're survivalists, like most animals, we adapt through stressful events. Kind of what we do, right? Similar to the body. If, when you're bench pressing, your muscles are not really happy about that, but the endorphins are, right? It's pulling things apart. And so this circle of capacity is something that everybody has, but it's like plastic. And so if you're like, picture this is something I talk a lot about in therapy. Picture this, you got a full-time job. You're not sure if you're going to be keeping it because of the pandemic, kids at home, and now they're dealing with having to do virtual school. You have to somehow manage all of these things. And then you have like an idiot president who shows up, right? And that's pretty massive. You can tell that I'm still dealing with that, even though he's not there. And so if you look at the RPM gauge, well, COVID pandemic, you're already going to be like here. 30% of your gauge is already engaged when you wake up in the morning because there's so many things you have to worry about. And now the potential to lose your job. Okay, now you're like halfway through. And now you've got 40% capacity to handle your day. How does that work, right? And just to kind of tie this together so you understand what I'm talking about with the RPM gauge, when we defend ourselves, that's when we hit the red line. Fight, flight, fawn, freeze. These things start to engage when that capacity is full, because your body's like, okay, I'm taking over. I'm running or drinking or whatever tool you have available to you at the time. And so in therapy, when this comes up, it's never about, okay, so this is how you don't worry about the COVID pandemic. Don't worry about it. Great, fantastic. This is how you do yoga through the fact that you're going to lose your job. But instead, it's like, well, tell me about it. What's your direct experience of this? How is that working? What are you actually feeling? So one thing that comes up a lot, so this might be tying into what you're saying, but cutting right through it, is that a lot of people are stressed and angry and frustrated. But that is like a secondary emotion that they're using, because what's actually happening is they're grieving. Something has happened that has changed how we view the world, which means the life we had before is different. It's like we've all been transported into this new plane of existence where we have to deal with this. And so now we're in this like collective grief. And when you're dealing with some people who are very uncomfortable with grief or sadness, I mean, this is my own personal work, which we can get into. We might not know how to express grief, or we're shamed by it, or all this stuff. So then we have to use the emotions that we got to let the pressure off. And that's usually anger and frustration, because typically I know for a lot of my clients dealing with like male mental health, it's that anger is literally the one we're allowed to show. So if we're sad, we're pissed off. If we're grieving, we're angry, right? Or we close in on ourselves and turn it into some sort of resentment because we don't know how to express this grieving energy. So when a client comes in with these issues, it's really all about talking about it. I'm not going to fix it. Tell me your experience. How is this experience shaping you? And 9 times out of 10, it's like, yeah, of course that's scary.
I mean, it seems that there's actually more of a risk knowing that you may not be fixed, but be forced to, I say forced to, but be encouraged to share those emotions, knowing they may be revealed for what they are with no immediate solution available as well.
That's where things, philosophically speaking, psychologically, this is why this job to me is like the ultimate act of practical philosophy. So when I started doing this, right here is how I started to realize that I found it. So my entire career as a philosopher, as I mentioned before, has been this selfish act of looking for something that works. Kind of in the sense of like Deleuze is creating concepts. I'm seeing something big and I need to create something to figure it out because it's scary or heavy. And it started because when I was 13, I was suicidal. And one day, like I was suicidal, I had a plan. It was like, here we go. This is the day. And I had a chance encounter with someone. Very chance. And it's not like they knew, but this person was so, I don't know how to put it, shone so brightly, let's just say. Because I originally thought it was like an act of love, like a beatific love situation, but I figured that out. And so I spent most of my time from 13 through my undergrad trying to figure out what the fuck happened.
With that particular event.
With that particular event, that's why I got into philosophy, is because I wanted to figure out what happened. Why did I change my mind? What went through all of this? And so for what I uncovered, I first thought it was love, which brought me into Dante's Divine Comedy, which was my obsession in my undergrad, the interplay between will and intellect, which led me to reciprocity. So how we can give meaningful relationships to other people and just actually care about them. Nothing more than that. And then how that makes a difference in someone's life. To my master's, where I did an undergrad, or my master's was on Amartya Sen's capability theory. And is trying to understand when we're dealing with something like capability deprivation, what's going on for someone, to then what I'm dealing with now, which was when I had that chance encounter, up until that point, I had never lived in a world where someone treated me like that. It was very simple. And it shocked me out of my despair milieu that I was living in. And it made me feel like I mattered, which was very shocking considering like how deeply bullied I was when I was younger and how the concept of belonging was foreign to me. So it's as if in one encounter with one smile, one conversation, I felt like I belonged. And I had to deal with the heavy and painful repercussions of that for 20 years until I sorted out what the fuck happened. And so what I have now learned or understand is we're not heard. People are not heard. A lot of fundamental needs for people is to be heard, acknowledged, and seen. And that's not just a pop culture word. It's to be seen for who you are. So when I'm talking to somebody who's dealing with like anger management issues, and they come in, they're like, you got to fix me. My anger is getting out of control. And we figure out from the story they're telling me that I'm starting to feel like physically, I can start to feel sad. The story is like making me sad. Then I'll use the body to go, are you sad about this? Or is there grief here? Or have I misheard you? Which is an honest question because in counseling, you do not want to misunderstand people. And then the minute someone hears it, it's like the door opens. Oh shit, that's what's happening. And then in a way that gives people permission to actually feel those emotions. And what's amazing to me is that the act of being able to have that permission from the other then gives you the permission yourself. So shame and guilt, it's not that they're powerless, but similar to that event when I was 13, it's like they didn't react fast enough to shield you. You couldn't climb into the armor quick enough. And it's like, fuck, wait a minute. I'm actually really sad about this or grieving about this. I'm not angry at all. It's devastating. And so then I'm getting emotional just talking about it because it's so powerful. So, and then the two of you have to deal with that, which is simply, let's feel it. Because what do? You don't just, here's the definition of grief and how we deal with it. No, we deal with it. We grieve. And then we learn how to grieve. And then we learn how to maintain that permission, which is a lot like a muscle. Mm-hmm. If you spend your whole life not being able to grieve or using the shame baton to like beat yourself out of grieving into anger because it's more socially appropriate, then eventually you're going to forget how to do that. So now you have to relearn how by letting it out every once in a while in a safe area. And counseling becomes that safe space.
See, that kind of story for me confirms something that I've long believed, especially in relation to the way that we consider therapeutic modalities against our political leanings or political commitments. Because, in the spaces that we work in on social media, we see people every day struggling with political issues. And beneath the surface of what we see, there is this overwhelming sense of grief, which is often connected and disconnected, either through some sort of ideological wedge that has been driven in there. But it seems to me that sometimes those positions or those commitments can become an emotional readout against the sort of raw experience or the shared experience, or even our ability just to be with a certain kind of emotion, whether that tendency was inculcated by our parents or whether it's because of some values that we have in our society. We are still living with heads on our necks. Our intellectual response, like you said, our intellectual reaction to grief, our tendency to want to explain things. Oh, here's the answer, versus being able to just kind of sit with an image of this person's life in the form of their narrative, in the form of their account, and just the simple power of reflecting that back to them, having it heard through the mouth of the other. To me, that's a collective experience. And this is what we've discussed in our other episode on James Hillman too. Like, what would it look like if these sort of practices were proliferated somehow, and maybe outside of the space of therapy, outside of conventional institutions? We're kind of goaded into these things by teachers and therapists and so forth. But then the question is, when we see somebody in line at Walmart or whatever, are we going to do those things?
Yeah, it would be great. It leads to some interesting conversations or confrontations, I'll tell you that. I know my wife always makes fun of me for the people I end up meeting on the street because I just will talk to them. And she's like, what happened there? Who's your new friend? I'm like, I don't know. He looks sad. He was whatever. And I went. But to, I don't know, stitch it together, whatever you want to call it. it's all about humans being human at the end of the day. And that's why categories are so difficult. It's because if we're going to put somebody in a category, it's saying this is how you human. And nobody knows what the hell we're doing. Everything is like a best guess at best, which I think is also why I've really like Deleuze and Guattari, because it's really just all chaos. And that's part of the fun, if I could say it, is it's the experimentation of being alive. And sometimes, most of the time, you have to bring people in, or you're called to bring people in through your body. Everything calls people in. If you just look at the act of crying, I mean, so for me, grief was, and I'm working with this now, was the most difficult thing to express for me. Because growing up, when I was taught how to grieve, it was that it was shameful and it was embarrassing, right? But I wasn't taught that directly. So most, men will have stories, or people will have stories where it's like, crocodile tears. He's always crying, or they're sensitive. I didn't hear that growing up, but I did watch my dad hide it all the time. And so it was almost like I got a concept of that's not what you do. And so it became very embarrassing to me. And I have recently, a couple months ago, I started going to therapy. Once again, because of you, I did Jung therapy. I was like, oh, that's cool. And so, but I had this moment, and this is where a lot of this crystallized for me, where we're talking about a friend of mine who passed away, and I started to choke up. And I immediately took a sip of water. Immediately. Because what you're doing there is like, I'm opening up, and now I'm going to interrupt that and squish that right back down, bottle it up, lock that into the attic or into the basement. And then my therapist was like, did you see what you did there? And I was like, what? I was thirsty. And I actually didn't know. It wasn't aware of how my body was reacting to these things. And then what she said was, what would it be like for you to just experience what bubbled up? And the minute she said it, I was like, fuck no. Like everything went off. My body was like, you shut this down, hang up the phone. Like everything went nuts. And in my head, I was like, what is happening? My brain is short circuiting right now. And I was not privy to the experience. I was standing outside of it. Yeah. And then a few days later, when talking with my wife, she asked me if I was okay. And I had hid my grief for a couple of days because a friend had recently passed away. And I remember picturing myself behind a glass box, because when I do this, I always picture myself locked in a glass box. And I can't get out. And so I want to say something. I want to be comforted, but I can't. So I'm screaming behind a glass box. And I just said the words, no. And the minute I said that, it all came out. And this was a 3-day process of really experiencing that grief, and then talking to my therapist about it, and then encountering my defenses that I didn't know I had, which was amazing because, and here's really the big thing for me that we can unpack if we want, is that it occurred to me while talking to my therapist the second time that I'd never lived in a world where I could express grief. So not only did I not know how, now I'm living in a world where I'm a lot more comfortable with it. I don't know what that scares the hell out of me, right? Shame has always played a part in that. I've always been embarrassed. So how's the world going to react? All of these things kind of show up. And that really speaks to that listening piece. There's something on the inside that wants to come out, and it's not some phantom or, it's you. If you're feeling it, you're honestly feeling it. What will happen when you let it out?
I really find this notion of the grief fascinating, particularly in terms of the bottling up, holding it in, and all of these actions, particularly in terms of how people are sort of socialized as masculine. It's fundamentally an economic notion. We can tie in anti-Oedipus, we can tie in Bataille, we can tie all of this together with the idea that, from the old Christian term, oikonomia, the economy, it's how the father manages his house. And to admit grief in public is to admit loss, a loss from one's entire life world, and therefore the household of one's being. And then in that sense, you've admitted a loss. And especially under neoliberalism, it's a shame to lose things. It's a shame to have waste, to have unnecessary expenditures, unless you've earned them and have already sort of won the game. You're the billionaire who can send, exploding cars out into fucking space or something. And the economics of grief, I mean, you could even tie it into Freud, the idea of an anal retentive personality, just holding in this idea of loss, waste. Everything has to be utile. Everything has to be for utility's sake. Everything has to be for keeping going on. If you lose someone, then you've lost part of your household. And can't you control your property? Well, I mean, what sort of man can't control his property? And it's that there's an entirely economic, in every sort of way, somatic, neurological, economic in a sense, financial, even in terms of familial, even possibly even theological, because God's got one over on you. He's got one of your own. And I really like this notion of trying to think about what sort of world could there be in which grief is allowed to be expressed. Because I think even in some of the moral psychology work I was doing in my undergrad, there was this question, like there's analytic philosophy papers where they just put out these really stupid questions for no reason. But this one was actually quite good. It was like, it was sort of a philosophy of grief and asking, well, if there's a reason to grieve, can it ever be rational to stop grieving? I was like, well, who the fuck cares? There's that very utile, very instrumental, rational logic there. And I think it's very good in terms of separating it from that entire economy. It's a great refusal to say no. If I need to, to quote Mao, if you need to shit kind of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I completely agree with that. And I mean, either the other side of that I'll give you my reaction, but also probably embedded in that is the taboo of grief, in the sense of part of the internal shame.
Absolutely.
Is you're worried about like burdening others. What are other people going to think? All of these things show up. But also, and so that was my way of agreeing with you. But also, to layer this on, which has become very apparent to me now and extremely interesting, is when you're thinking about grief as loss, because we know it's loss. So it can come from many different areas, but we'll speak to just losing a person you love. Grief is also the most intense emotion a human can have. Because if you notice, when you grieve and you allow yourself to express it, every other emotion shows up to that party. Mm-hmm. Anger, everything shows up. And I know that there's like 5 stages of grief and all that stuff that people talk about, but that's just a way to kind of commodify that experience. But everyone's different in how they do it, but everything shows up to the party. And if you think about why, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, well, since November, obviously, it's because when you're grieving, I picture it kind of like being on a ship, right? So when you're on a ship, if there's issues with a ship, you can fix it, right? So the toilet's broken, you can plunge it, you can fix the planks, whatever. But grief is like an oncoming storm because there's nothing you can do about it. The loss is lost. All you can do, and this is the process of grief, is weather it. You can just weather it. And it's not something you can avoid because we know, when you're dealing with the body, that grief can be held for years. It can show up 20 years later if you don't process it. Anger does the same thing. Your body just holds on to these energies or whatever. And so when you're grieving, this is my thoughts on it. The reason it's so intense is because you're dealing with a loss, which means your body is trying to orient itself to a new reality. And I remember when I finally realized this, I was thinking, I'm living in a world now where this person isn't. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And this was, I forgot to mention this, but this was the person who saved my life when I was 13. Now I'm living in a world where they're not. And the thought of that is so horrific, right? And so the process of grief, to process that energy, is to orient yourself to that reality, which is a bit different than coming to terms with it, because I find that to be a bit too medical. Because grief is never done. Like you never get over it. You carry it differently. The person is symbolized differently in you as part of your environment. And I can think it can be very dangerous to get over it and all these things with people. So one of the practices in narrative therapy, which highlights this really well, which I really like, if somebody comes in for grief, let's say sudden loss or anything, then the process is all about grieving with you. So the questions have to do with getting to know the person who passed. Almost all of the questions are all about how do we get to know the person that passed? It's not just about what they meant to you, but who are these people? Because what's underlying that is that this society doesn't have the practice of grieving. And just like you said, it's like outlawed, taboo. So now we're going to share this grieving together and see what it does and take it from there.
And it seems as if the process, I mean, when you go through it on an individual level, on the other side of things, after the storm is gone, almost analogous to a thunderstorm, there's a great sense of relief and clarity and often joy, to the point where certain inchoate ideas or beliefs about ourselves seem consummated in the event. We come out the other side with not only a sort of refreshed vitality, but maybe an affirmation about what we are, who we've been, who we think we're becoming, and so forth. And this is the one thing, when I look at, just to tie it back to the pandemic a little bit, I see this event as a worldwide emotional event of grief, fit with all of the characteristics in the commodified analysis, the denial, the bargaining, and so forth, all happening, in this sort of chaotic cycle, of course, the blame, the resentment, and so forth, the retaliation. And it makes me think what it would be like what does that look like, not only at the individual level, but the collective level? Is there a joy on the other side? How do we process this emotionally? Clearly, and this is where my political commitments come in. Clearly, the institutions that we have in place to mitigate the crises are insufficient worldwide. The beliefs that we have, both as groups and individuals, are not enough to keep us from going off this precipice that we're going off today as we speak. Who knows how many hundreds of thousands of people have contracted new cases in the U.S. here today. But I think fundamentally that if we are to get beyond this, I think our sense of perhaps supremacy as those living in the global north, has engendered a kind of hubris about what's happening, and that, we just make it through these things. We just need to achieve herd immunity. Like I often think about the sort of psychological loading of that term too. Like, oh, if we all just contract this thing, we'll get through it. We don't have to deal with any of the emotions of this. Let's just deal with it. It sort of belies the total character of the event, the losses that have been incurred, the world we're not getting back after this is all said and done. Yeah,
and that was really shown when I have two minds of this, but that was really shown when it first happened, right? I know that for here, it was on the news and people were like, all right, for the pandemic, I'm going to lose 20 pounds and go to the gym and learn a new craft. In my head, I was thinking, holy fuck, people are like this. This is a freaky thing to happen. Freak out just a bit. Whatever. Go outside and scream, get a pillow and just scream fuck into it. Just let that out, because this is not this isn't a party we've all signed up to.
It's almost like a divorce in a way. He's out of my life once and for all. That's right. We're going to Vegas.
Just freak out a little.
I mean, I think that the way in which we've discussed all of these issues and this concept of herd immunity, I mean, I can almost feel it echoing across so many different disciplines. This necessity to kind of find a homogenized total that can protect itself from, if not an outside, because I don't think that's a particularly helpful way to understand what's occurred at all. In fact, I think it probably is a dangerous one. It doesn't allow for us to process this either in a sense of community, right? Because there are those who are immune and then there are those who are not. Or as individuals, because it's always in relation to our contribution or lack of contribution to this, pathogen and its development. And I feel when we talk about trying to find a post-COVID world and so on, or a return to normalcy, I feel we try to paper over loss itself. And I feel so much of therapeutic practice that when I was a child experienced was just attempting to foreclose and paper over all of this stuff. So I feel in a certain sense part of the process of, and Foucault says this in Psychiatric Power. He says, "Show me your symptoms, and you will make me a doctor." Right? And I feel like, in a certain sense, one can make a point of like, show me your sublimation, and I will build you a social order. Right? And like, so much of this is just like, no, there is no loss. There is only return. Come back. And I just feel like all of these processes, from, the Freudian psychoanalyst to the police officer, is just something that's just trying to pull you back into the center of this distribution. And I wonder if the way we're talking about COVID is even just contributing to that pull.
It's almost like the structures themselves are expressing that defense over grief.
I think there's also a very political sense of the grief here, and that, I mean, to be as explicit as possible about it, none of this shit had to happen. Like, I mean, this is especially, for example, let's say, in the Anglosphere particularly, or maybe say just the United States and the UK, we kind of had these political movements of left populism. I have many critiques of left populism, but they, Sanders, Corbyn, and these things, the pandemic kicks in just as they collapse. These movements collapse. Corbyn's defeated general election. Bernie is rat fucked by the Democrats. As in hindsight, we could think, that was probably going to happen. But I think it doesn't help us that there was an entire investment of hope. There was an incubation of a sort of a newfound political hope, and not necessarily the most radical one. It had a capacity to incubate new radical ideas, but at the time it was very, it was relatively mild in terms of social democracy from a Western, Northern Hemisphere kind of context. And I think there is also a sense of political grief, because we're sort of seeing the loss of a hypothetical political future in the electoral sense. Not only that's been taken away, but we're seeing the consequences stacking up in morgues, in actual eugenic pandemic policy, in actual mounds of death, withholding of vaccines. The so-called most prepared ones are the least prepared, and there is a sense of grief not only from the future, there's a sense of grief for the future, political grief, because like this, there's a possibility which has been taken away, and it's not like we need to return to it as such, as that moment has passed. Otherwise, you wouldn't learn from it as much. But there's that sense of grieving from the future, and in a sort of very Mark Fisher kind of way of putting it.
Yeah, I feel like, though, too, that on top of like, and I think obviously if you like follow, my Twitter, I'm apoplectic about this every 5 minutes, but like the eugenic policies that we see coming from like the New York governor at the point at which the pandemic was sort of a sort of new phenomenon for us. And it wasn't necessarily that like, what I think actually dissipated was this idea of a aspirational political future where it was a question of like, okay, can we define this as social democracy? Like, who is the social democrat in the field of political operation? What's left is just governmentality. What's left is the logic of utility and production. And like, what we have to learn now is actually that it's just so much more than a series of political programs and the nominalism of a political future, right? Of Corbynism versus New Labor. What we find, or actually know, like what it is it's a nurse on the floor shifting technology from one patient to another, and you can put whatever fucking name you want on top of the party, but it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's that interaction between that body and that practitioner. What it is a series of technologies, and we can all pat ourselves on the back as we give $5 to this candidate, or put this fucking bumper sticker on our Honda. At the end of the day, it's actually just these technologies. So I think in a certain sense, like the entire Band-Aid was ripped off, and all of these processes of trying to find a post-pandemic normal is an attempt to like rub it back on, but the adhesive is just not working right.
And so now it's left to a Soul podcast, Stranded at Sea, talking about Carl Rogers' methods of listening in summary, and hopefully that us together here on this small ship, that we can all bring it back, or at least we can institute this new listening, the collective listening, the overcoming of collective grief with Chuck, who was so gracious to appear on our show today. Thank you for being here, and thank you for supporting us. And also thank you for giving us feedback about our reading group that we have coming up. We saw your contribution, and that's something that I think we'll want to let our listeners know, if that they want to continue to support us and they want to do things with us this year. The reading group is a great way to do it. We'll probably do once a month. We're still hashing it out. You can check our Patreon account to see what the suggestions have been. I won't even say what we're probably going to land on, but probably a mishmash of different essays and so forth. But thanks again, Chuck.
You're welcome.
Chuck, do you have any final plugs?
Sure. I do have a podcast, Couch to Couch, Making Therapy Make Sense. This is a very different podcast than this one. The podcast was developed because I had a couple of shout outs from friends and family looking for therapists. And when they looked on, the advertisement that therapists do, they had no fucking clue what they were reading or how do you even find one. So I decided to make a podcast where I interview other therapists so that you can get the flavor for what's happening. And my philosophy does come out every once in a while because you can't hold that shit back. So it is a lot of fun and I enjoy it quite a bit. So they can check that out. It's on Spotify, everything but Apple Podcast, because I'm technologically inept and couldn't figure out how to put it on there. But Spotify is great. So that's Making Therapy Make Sense with Chuck LeBlanc.
And also, is there a way that you get or attract new clients? Is there a way that people can reach you if they want to speak with you, whether it's in Canada or somewhere else?
Yeah, it's you can go to the website, chuckleblanccounseling.ca. You can also reach, it's the same. There's a thing in there. You can just slap that in there. I'm on Instagram, couch.2.couch. I'm also on Instagram as Chuck LeBlanc Counseling. And feel free to reach out. If anybody who listens to the show, if they have specific things they want us to talk about, I usually do everything off the cuff. You can let me know. I'm open to it all.